You know when you hear a name and it just sticks with you? Ramon Escobar is one of those names, right?
Hmm.
It's not just that you vaguely remember it from the news either.
Right.
This guy's story is seriously messed up.
Mm.
He killed 7 people in like just 1 month back in 2018.
Yeah.
And then, get this, just last year, 2023, he killed again. But this time, it was in prison. So what we're going to do today is deep dive into Escobar using sources like his Wikipedia page,
Mm.
news articles, the whole deal. And we're not just looking at what he did, but the why. Like, what the heck happened? What was his background? Were there any signs?
Yeah, the background is interesting because it's this crazy contrast between his early life and then, well, the murders, obviously.
Right.
He was born in El Salvador in 1971, right in the middle of what they call the football war. And that war, man, it just destroyed that country. So you've got poverty, people forced out of their homes, violence everywhere.
A whole generation messed up
Mhm.
from that, basically.
Yeah, and that's the world Escobar's coming from.
Okay, so then he comes to the U.S., but illegally, right?
Yep.
And gets deported multiple times. 6, I think, between 1997 and 2011.
Yep. 6 times. But here's the thing. His early crimes, yeah, they were bad, don't get me wrong. But it was mostly like theft, assault, trespassing.
Stuff that doesn't exactly scream future serial killer.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, because it's not your typical progression from petty crime to, mass murder. There are even people who knew him personally said he wasn't violent.
So what was the turning point then?
Right. Like, what happened that made him snap? What turned him into a killer?
Yeah, it's like a piece of the puzzle is missing. We see these early crimes, and then boom, 2018, it's a bloodbath. He starts by killing his own uncle and aunt in Houston.
And the way he did it, man, is brutal. Beating, strangulation, dump their bodies in dumpsters.
They found them in a landfill, eventually.
Awful. And you see the shift in the types of crimes, too. Like, the earlier stuff, maybe it was out of need, impulsive, who knows. But these murders, there's planning there, cold-bloodedness, it's different.
Yeah, it's like something in him just changed. And after he kills them, he runs off to California, ends up in L.A., living on the streets.
And that's where it gets really bad.
Yeah, he starts targeting other homeless people.
And that's what's so disturbing, right? It's not random. It's predatory. Homeless people, they're already marginalized, ignored, like they don't matter to society.
Yeah.
That makes them easy targets.
It's horrifying. And how he attacked them with a baseball bat while they slept? Just brutal. Some survived, but with awful injuries.
Oh, yeah.
There was one guy, Juan Antonio Ramirez. Escobar attacked him in September 2018, and he was in a coma until he died in 2021.
Wow.
Like, that's the thing, right? Escobar's violence, it had a ripple effect, even years later.
Absolutely. It's not just isolated incidents. It's the families, the communities,
Yeah.
everyone affected.
Yeah. And then they finally catch him right after he attacks this other guy, Jorge Martinez, who also died, by the way. The police found him with the bat, bolt cutters, the whole 9 yards, and he confessed to killing his aunt and uncle. Said it was because he was angry at them and that he was having money problems.
But does that explain it all?
Right. I mean, killing them, it's hard to wrap your head around.
That's the question, isn't it? Were those motives enough, or is there more to it, something darker going on? And then even after they put him away for life, no parole, 2022, he does it again.
This time, in prison, kills his cellmate, Juan Villanueva, who, by the way, was in for sexual assault of a minor.
Oh, wow.
And he strangled him, just like his aunt, and left this creepy note explaining why.
What kind of reasons could you even have in prison?
Oh, stuff like Villanueva's hygiene was bad. He wouldn't move. He didn't take Escobar seriously.
Seriously?
It's so bizarre. On the one hand, these reasons are so trivial compared to, murder. But on the other hand, shows how detached he is from reality. Like, he can justify violence over something so small.
Chilling, man.
Yeah.
And it gets worse. The note, he ends it with, "Please meet the devil."
I know, it's creepy as hell. Like, he knows what he's doing is evil, but he owns it.
And that's what I don't get. He seems totally aware of what he's doing, but why? What made him this way?
Yeah. Is it his past? Is he mentally ill? Was it just bad luck? Like, how do you even begin to unpack all that?
Right. And that's where we start getting into the really difficult questions about mental illness, the immigration system, how we treat the most vulnerable people in our society.
It's complicated.
It is. And it's about to get even more complicated.
So we've been talking about some pretty messed up stuff with this case, how brutal the crimes were, the weird reasons he gave for killing his cellmate. But one thing we haven't really dug into is, like, Escobar's mental state. The sources mention he got diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was locked up. Do you think that played a part in all this?
It's the question everyone asks, right? When you hear about a case like this, you gotta wonder. Schizophrenia is a serious thing, you know? And it can show up in so many different ways, hallucinations, delusions, all that.
Yeah, and I remember reading that people with schizophrenia sometimes have trouble figuring out what's real and what's not.
Exactly. Like their brain kind of messes with them.
And that seems relevant here, right?
Right.
Especially with that note he left after killing Villanueva. It was so matter of fact, like, oh, by the way, I killed this guy because he was annoying.
It's like he was ordering a pizza or
Yeah.
something. And that's why we can't just ignore the mental illness aspect. Schizophrenia can really screw with your judgment, your perceptions, your whole reality. But it's important to remember that having schizophrenia doesn't automatically make you a violent person.
Right. So we're not saying it's an excuse,
No, not at all.
but it's something we got to consider, right?
Absolutely. It's about trying to understand the whole picture,
Sure.
all the things that could led to this, you know? And with Escobar, there are other things we need to look at too.
Like what?
Oh, what about the deportations? They sent him back to El Salvador 6 times between 1997 and 2011, and he still managed to come back to the U.S. every time, illegally.
That's insane. It makes you wonder how effective our immigration system really is. Like, are there loopholes? Are things slipping through the cracks?
It's probably a whole bunch of things, honestly. There's no single thing you can point to and say that's what let him back in. But he shouldn't have been able to do that 6 times. Come on. It shows that the system's got problems, you know?
And those problems have real consequences, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if Escobar had been stopped, those 7 people in 2018, they might still be alive.
It's heavy, man. And that's why we need to look at this stuff, not just when it's too late, but before it happens. How do we make border security better? How do we make sure agencies are talking to each other? These are big questions.
Big, important questions. Okay, so we've got this messed up childhood, potential mental illness, problems with the immigration system. But what about the victims? Why do you think he went after homeless people specifically during that spree in 2018?
That's a tough one. I think there are a few things at play here. For one, homeless people, they're seen as easy targets, right? They're vulnerable, they're often alone, and if they disappear, people might not notice right away.
And let's be real, there's this messed up idea in society that homeless people are somehow less important. Like their lives don't matter as much.
Exactly. It's sick, but that's the reality. And that makes them even more vulnerable to predators like Escobar. But there's another thing I think about with this case, and it's Escobar's own experience. He was homeless himself at times, both here in the U.S. and in El Salvador after they deported him.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so it's possible that he saw himself in them, you know, like he was projecting his own pain, his own anger onto them.
So, like, they were scapegoats for all his problems.
It's a messed up thought, but it makes sense when you think about how brutal those attacks were. The rage, the dehumanization, it's like there was something more going on than just picking an easy target.
Okay, so maybe we can kind of understand why he chose those victims, as horrible as that sounds. But I still don't get the prison murder. He was never getting out anyway. What was the point?
I know, right? That one's a real head-scratcher. The reasons he gave in that note, they just seem so lame. Like his cellmate's hygiene, really.
Yeah, you don't kill someone over that.
Exactly. It's like he was grasping at straws. So what's the real story? Maybe those were just triggers, you know? Like something set him off, but the rage was already there, simmering under the surface. Or maybe it was about control. He had no control in prison, right?
So maybe killing his cellmate was a way to feel powerful again.
It's possible. It's like even in prison, he still needed to dominate, to show he was in charge. And remember that line in his note? Please meet the devil. It's chilling.
I know. Like he was proud of being evil.
It's a reminder that evil exists, you know, not just in stories, but in real life. And it's our job to face it, try to understand it, and do everything we can to stop it.
Heavy stuff.
It is. But we can't just ignore it. Escobar's story, it's like a wake-up call. We got to look at our own beliefs, our own systems, and ask ourselves, how do we stop this from happening again?
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, the big question is, what can we learn from this? How can we take what we've learned about Escobar and actually use it to prevent future tragedies?
That's the million-dollar question, and we're going to try to answer it in the next part of this deep dive. We need to look at the big picture, the systems, the individuals, the things we miss, and ask ourselves, what can we do better? How do we create a world where this stuff doesn't happen? Or at least where it happens a lot less?
Okay, so we've spent all this time trying to understand Ramon Escobar, right? Like what made him tick, why he did what he did. It's heavy stuff. But I keep thinking about what you said earlier, even in all this darkness, there's still hope. So how do we actually, take that hope and do something with it? What can we learn from Escobar's story that might help prevent something like this from happening again?
That's the big question, right? And there's no easy answer. But if we look at everything we've talked about, we can start to see some ways forward. Like, one of the most obvious things is we got to fix the immigration system.
He has 6 deportations, and he still comes back.
hmm
Something's clearly broken. It's like, is it border security? Are agencies not talking to each other? Are there laws that need to be changed?
It could be all of the above. So we got to ask, are we putting enough resources into this? Do we have the people, the technology, the money to actually control our borders? And do we have a system to track people who've been deported and make sure they don't just sneak back in? These are policy questions, big picture stuff.
And it's not just about keeping people out, right? It's also about understanding why they're trying to get in the first place.
Hmm.
Like Escobar's childhood in El Salvador, all that poverty and violence from the war, that definitely played a role in him wanting to come to the U.S.
Right, and that's what we need to tackle the root causes of illegal immigration. Poverty, lack of opportunity, violence, corrupt governments. If we can help make those countries better, people won't feel like they have to risk their lives to escape.
So it's like we need to tighten up our own borders, but also work on helping other countries improve their situations.
Exactly. It's a long game, not a quick fix. It takes cooperation between countries, investment in programs that actually help people, and a real commitment to making those places stable and safe.
Okay, that's one piece of the puzzle. But what about Escobar's mental health and the fact that he targeted homeless people? What do we do about that?
Mental health is huge, man. There's so much work to be done, both in the justice system and in society as a whole. People with mental illness need access to care, to treatment, whether they're in prison or out on the streets.
And remember, we talked about how schizophrenia might have played a part in what Escobar did, but that doesn't mean everyone with mental illness is dangerous.
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, they're more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators.
Right. And when we stigmatize mental illness, it just makes it harder for people to get help. It pushes them more.
Totally. We got to change the way we talk about this stuff. It's not about judgment, it's about compassion. It's about understanding and supporting people who are struggling.
So better access to mental health care, more education to fight the stigma.
Exactly. And we can't forget about social safety nets, things like affordable housing, job training, healthcare. If people have those things, they're less likely to fall through the cracks in the first place.
Which brings us back to the homeless victims. They were easy targets because they were so vulnerable, so invisible to the rest of society.
Right, and that's what we got to change. Homelessness is a complex problem, but there are things we can do. More affordable housing, better access to mental health and addiction treatment, job training programs.
And it's not just about giving people stuff, right? It's about changing how we think about homelessness. We got to fight the stigma, see the humanity in everyone, and support policies that actually help people get off the streets.
100%. It's about community, about shared responsibility. It's about understanding that everyone deserves a chance to live a good life, no matter what their situation is.
Okay, so we've talked about some concrete things we can do: immigration, mental health, homelessness. But there's also something bigger here, something at the core of Escobar's story that we can't ignore. And that's the idea of vigilance, like paying attention to the warning signs, speaking up when something seems off.
You're so right. It's easy to brush things off, to make
Mhm.
excuses for bad behavior, to look the other way when someone's struggling. But Escobar's story shows us that those early signs, they can escalate. And if we don't do anything, the consequences can be devastating.
There were people who knew Escobar early on who said he wasn't violent. But there were still signs, right? The theft, the assaults, the trespassing.
Exactly. Maybe those things didn't mean he was going to become a serial killer, but they should have been red flags. They were signs that something was wrong.
So what can we do as individuals to be more vigilant? Like, how do we actually recognize those warning signs and do something about them?
I think it starts with being willing to engage, to have tough conversations, to support people even when it's hard. It's about noticing when someone's behavior changes, trusting our gut when something feels wrong, and speaking up when we see something bad happening.
So it's about being involved in our communities, looking out for each other, and recognizing that we all have a responsibility to keep each other safe.
Exactly. It's not about judging people or being the morality police. It's about offering compassion, understanding, and support. It's about creating a world where people feel safe asking for help and where those who are struggling are met with kindness, not judgment.
That's a powerful message. And it's something that really sticks with me after learning about Ramon Escobar and all the terrible things he did. By being vigilant, by pushing for change, by creating a culture of compassion and support, we can stop these tragedies from happening, or at least make them a lot less common.
That's what gives me hope. Even after all the darkness we've talked about, it's the fact that humans are capable of empathy, of change, of making the world a better place. That's what keeps me going.
I feel that. Well, folks, that was your deep dive into the disturbing case of Ramon Escobar. We hope you found it informative and maybe you think a little bit. If you want to learn more, definitely check out the sources we use. There's a lot more to this story, and we encourage you to keep digging.